I think this is a great time to segue into the case study that you very kindly prepared for us, which sort of takes into account all of these things that we just spoke about, and will allow folks on the call and even those watching the recording later to sort of really ground out how this would operate. Folks, so I'm just going to share my screen and just put up a small PPT. Teju is going to take us through it. And basically, how we're going to present it is there's a little bit of context setting in terms of, okay, you're, a person in the operations team or in the strategy team, there's a certain solution you have to develop. And we start by, defining the problem, what is the issue, then go into possible hypothesis, and then try and ask different questions, right, to gather some insight, some data from where we can finally form the solution. So I'll just be sharing my screen. Teju will be hosting us.
Awesome. So I will give that this is not based in, it's only partially based in real life, given that, I don't want to take names of the hospital and so on. So look, the context is basically, clearly you're in the founder's office of a hospital. And I think the very specific problem statement that was given was there are a set of customer complaints from a patient experience perspective that were happening on a particular floor, which was the executive health check service. And for broader context for people, as you would imagine, a hospital really cares much more about hospitalization because that's where the revenue is, the doctor talent is. So the focus is much more around surgeries and hospitalization. It's really not around outpatient services. And in the hierarchy of things, a health check would probably be amongst the lowest in the hierarchy, right? Because at least if I'm doing an outpatient consult, I might turn into a hospital patient in the future. Health check is generally healthy people not having a problem. If at all you're going to come to me, it's many years in the future. So it's not really an area that's focused at all within the hospital. So this was a very, very small, minor kind of throwaway problem that was being faced, right? And just so that everybody can understand kind of the lay of the land, I've tried to keep it very simple and generic, so we won't get into the technicalities of it, but you need to think about the executive health check as basically a sequence of 6 tests that you're doing, starting with a blood test, then you're doing an X-ray, then you're doing an ultrasound, then you're doing let's say an echocardiogram and whatever else, right? So you have 6 steps, and that's happening sequentially for each person. And that's basically everything you need to know about the floor. So we can move on, or Rohit, if you want to throw out questions, because I think the key thing here is to figure out, as I said, go back to the question statement itself and start gathering some information so that you know what the right question is to begin with. So we can pick up each of these and really talk through it. I think the very obvious starting, if there are complaints, what are people complaining about, right? So let's start there, and the easiest way and talk to a bunch of people and say what is really happening. And you can also talk to a few customers to understand what the situation is. And I can give the additional context here that that the complaints were primarily around waiting time. As you wait for both your blood test and your ultrasound, 2 things happen. One, you're generally fasting. So people are very, very cranky. And the second thing is that for an ultrasound, you have to generally be full bladder. So people are even more cranky. So you have a group of people, all of them chock-a-block in the 8 to 10 a.m. slot, all of them basically waiting for the single machine, and all of them extremely uncomfortable through the period, right? So that's the situation. And that was very easy to figure it out because, trust me, everybody was saying it and everybody was very vocal about how they felt about this, right? So that's basically like the starting point of the problem is, okay, we have a bunch of complaints. It seems like it's a basic supply chain issue, if you will, of just process flow and process design. But I think this is where it's helpful to add a little bit more of a larger context and not just focus on the very narrow, I have a bunch of complaints, I just need to solve this complaint, right? So if you step back and start looking at some of the larger contexts, right? So, for example, what does the customer profile look like? Who are the people that we're serving with the executive health check? And I think, of course, as I mentioned, and as you would imagine, the customer profile will be very different for the executive health check versus people coming to the hospital. You're getting healthy people who are coming for their once in a year health checkup. Mostly they're working professionals. Mostly the demographic is younger than what you get in the rest of the hospital. Now, when somebody is really sick and they're waiting for the doctor, they're still annoyed about it. But they need the doctor, and the need trumps everything else, right? So they are more willing to wait and have that conversation. When you have a healthy person who doesn't believe they quite need this service and you're making them wait, the level of impatience and just people being annoyed with this is significantly higher. So that made a big difference as well, in terms of everybody on the floor understanding that this is not a regular hospital patient, right? This is a very different customer profile that you're dealing with. Then comes the question of, why are we even doing this service? What is the financial contribution? Is this even an important problem to solve, right? Because you could think of this in one of two completely different ways. One is you could basically say, you know what, this is not an important service to the hospital. It's people who aren't my primary customer profile for the hospital. So maybe I should not even be servicing these people. Maybe I just, in a dramatic bookend, maybe I just shut down the service and I don't need it. And I save myself trouble and effort and all the people on the floor, and I free up capacity for the hospital, right? So that's one end. And so if you looked at, and this is surprising, but nobody actually looks at the financial context of sub business lines. I mean, they do now, but they didn't back then in hospitals. But if you actually looked at that, you would realize that while the revenue contribution for the hospital was very, very low, it was less than 5%. However, this was because it's largely diagnostics and because it's largely CapEx, you don't have any running costs per se. It's a very high gross margin business and a very high profit business for the hospital, right? And so at that point, I think the executive health check is actually twice as profitable as the rest of the hospital put together. Primarily because, like I said, you've already invested in a bunch of these diagnostic equipment, and you don't really have to spend a lot more to keep it running. So once you have that context, then it became very clear that the problem statement wasn't as simple as are you solving complaints? The problem statement is, how do I, if I think of this as a separate business line altogether, then how do I really think about it and make that grow? How do I build a large business vertical out of it if this was entirely my business to run, right? And that's when you ask the questions of, do I have the right product? What is competition doing? If you forget what the hospital is doing right now and you say, I'm starting this afresh and I'm solving this from a first principles basis, right? Which is that all I know about this market is that there are people who need a health checkup. Now you have to go back and understand who else is providing this, what is that customer's options, when they have these other options, why are they coming to me at all, and how do I get more people to come to me and then deliver a great experience, right? So suddenly you're not solving this problem around the single dimension of what should my patient flow look like. You're starting to solve this across how do I design the product itself in a way that makes the most sense, both from an operational delivery perspective, but also from a customer perspective, right? And short answer for the information on competition was that, of course, every hospital provides it. Patients do it because hospitals end up just being top of mind, or that companies have signed a contract with the hospital. Otherwise, they don't really care very much about where they're going. And I think very much, obviously, there was a rise of home delivery of diagnostics at that point. So people much preferred not doing any of the radiology tests, just getting a blood test at home, calling it a health checkup, and being done with it, right? So I think there was with a lot of patients, a lack of understanding as to why am I even coming into the hospital for this? All I need is a blood test to tell me that I'm healthy and then I'm fine. Why do I need a USG or an X-ray or any of this other stuff, right? And so with all of this information kind of put together, there's a list of potential things that you can end up doing, right? And I'll talk a little bit while we're on the competitor page about the product itself, because as we said, you had a bunch of people coming in at 8 a.m. because all of them had exactly the same annual health checkup list of tests, which is not necessary. Clearly, somebody who is greater than 50 needs a different set of tests versus somebody who is, let's say, 30. So the starting point was, can we define standardized but different health check products depending on the demographic of the patient? So you have, for example, a 30 to 40-year-old male package is different from 30 to 40-year-old female package, a senior citizen package is different, and so on. And then can you create that and look at what can you deliver at home, what can you deliver in the hospital, and actually recreate the product altogether, right? So Rohit has a very helpful summary here in terms of what have we learned so far, basically around, we know that patients are complaining because a lot of them are coming and getting stuck there. And so that's a utilization and flow problem to solve. The second is we know that the customer profile is very different from what the rest of the hospital is used to dealing with. You know that there is competition that is fundamentally solving for people being at home, solving for convenience, and so on. And you know that this, if done well, could be a significant profit contributor for the hospital. And that's the strongest case to basically say, how do we actually make a business that grows, right? So some of the solutions and literally the step way we had gone through the process. I would say as we learned more about the problem, the things that we started doing and then working our way up the chain of outcomes, right? So the first was just fix the immediate problem, which is I could either add another USG machine, I could design some basic things that didn't need USG, so I didn't have a waiting line outside that. And then that's one option. Or I could basically stagger people coming in. So I gave some slots in the morning, some slots in the evening for people who didn't need the USG, right? These are very, very simple. And obviously, none of it was just simple because then you have to go back and get the doctor to sign off on is it okay to do this without a USG? Who needs this? How do we triage it? So there's complexity behind each of these, but this is, let's say, a very simple way of saying, I just want to fix the immediate flow and the immediate problem of crowding I have on my floor so that patients stop being angry with me. The second is to say that, look, let me think about the role that EHC is playing for the hospital right now, which is basically as a slight marketing tool. People are going to corporate, signing these contracts, all with the hope of having that relationship with the corporate, right? So given that we've learned that the customer profile is different here, and it's healthy people, it's working professionals, people who prioritize convenience and experience, can you actually create a premium experience? Can I charge more and have very few slots so that you come in, but it feels like a very personalized and private experience on the floor, and I'm charging you accordingly for it? Can we look at different payment models with the corporate itself? So instead of all of their employees coming on one day, I have a subscription model whereby you can come in, let's say, any weekend over the next 3 months, and I'll still service you the same way. Or the opposite, which is for a particular company, I'm just going to lock down the floor, because if you're waiting with your friends and colleagues, then you're less likely to be angsty about the whole situation, right? And this is still thinking about EHC as a, how do I look at the customers and just deliver a better experience? I think what really makes the switch in terms of moving this from being an operational problem to solving it more strategically is when you think about it as a separate business line with its own potential and you start redesigning everything entirely, right? So you start looking at different target segments, different products. What can I deliver at home? And if I'm truly thinking of this as my own business line, now I'll start thinking about staffing, right? So one very simple thing, the rest of the hospital, mostly they shut down on Sundays. But you can keep this going because if it's a working professional, it's easier for them to come in on a Sunday than on a weekday. So simple things like that, where you have to then go back and ask for resources and invest behind the business line, which you can do with confidence only because you know that the profitability of this is really good. You've worked through the pricing versus the competition, you've worked through the customer segments, and so on. And that really gives you the ability to go and say, I want to invest more resources behind this. And I'm going to try 4 or 5 different experiments to see what really works for this customer segment from an experience perspective that will make us differentiated versus what is existing in the market, right? So, including, and there are some examples in Bangalore of this, people doing purely prime slots, only 4 people in the building at the time that you are there, but for a price point that's 4x higher than what you would charge otherwise. But there is a market for it, right? It requires a little bit of piloting and figuring out how some of this can work. So that's just some context. Happy to take questions if there are any about this particular situation. But I can also give you some background that eventually, I think as of now, this is a focused vertical in that I would say it's still not, obviously hospitals will always think of inpatient, but it is a large enough vertical to have its own leadership patients team and be running on a separate PNL, which I think is it's a very positive change that has happened in the last 5 years.